the third name on Maren Solis's list, was already dead when she arrived at Veth Crossing Station. She had spent 11 days working her way across the Periphery to reach him, 2 transit hops, a forged cargo manifest, 4 days waiting in a maintenance bay that smelled like coolant and cooked aluminum. And when she finally found the apartment, the door was open, and the Vetharak operative called Solen Var was sitting in a chair with a look on his face that said he had been expecting someone else entirely. He had not been expecting a second team. Var's own people had reached him first, which meant that somewhere in the chain between Maren's handler on Earth and the Periphery relay, there was a leak, and the 12 individuals responsible for the Karath Summit massacre were now aware that someone was hunting them. She stood in the apartment doorway and looked at Var for a moment. He had been one of the 7 who opened fire in the Summit Plaza. The Karath Summit footage had been played on every news feed in human space for 6 weeks, 31 human diplomatic personnel, 4 civilian translators, 3 junior envoys who had graduated from the academy the previous spring. The Vetharak Sovereignty's official position was that its operatives had not been present on Karath Station. The summit footage was, according to the Sovereignty, fabricated. Maren photographed the apartment, noted the time of death for her report, and left. She was 24 years old, which was young for this assignment. Her handler, a quiet man named Das who ran operations from a desk in the Callahan building, had told her so the morning he gave her the list. She had said she was old enough. He had said she would be older by the end of it, and that was different. She had been at the summit. Not in the plaza when it happened. She had been in a lower corridor reviewing transit credentials for the afternoon delegation session. She had heard the shots through the station's internal audio system, a flat rattling sound that the emergency alerts had reached before she did. And by the time she made it to the plaza level, the shots had stopped, and the plaza was full of people who were not moving anymore. She had identified 7 of the 12 operatives herself, from the summit footage, and from the interview files she had spent the following 3 weeks compiling. The identification work had been straightforward and meticulous, the kind of work she had been trained for, cross-referencing transit records, station access logs, biometric data from the plaza cameras. Systematic. She had been good at it. Das had come to her apartment on the 43rd day after the massacre with the list in a sealed physical envelope, which was not how the agency typically communicated. He had sat at her kitchen table and told her the authorization had come from above his clearance level. 12 names. Confirmed responsible. Earth was not bringing them to a tribunal. She had asked why not. He had told her that the Vetharak Sovereignty would not recognize tribunal jurisdiction over its operatives, that a formal accountability proceeding would take between 8 and 12 years given the Sovereignty's record of procedural delay, and that the agency had assessed the probability of meaningful legal outcome as low enough to be effectively 0. She had looked at the envelope for a long time. She had said yes. The first name had been straightforward, in the way that the word straightforward carries a weight it never carried before. The second had required 3 weeks, and a set of circumstances she had not planned but had been able to use. The third was already dead. She found the fourth name, Oreth Kess, logistics coordinator for the operational cell, 4 months after the massacre, working cargo transit out of a Vetharak commercial hub on the edge of Sovereignty space. She spent 2 weeks watching him. He was not what she had expected. He had a family, a mate, and 2 young ones who met him at the transit gate when he came off shift and grabbed his hands and pulled him toward the food market on the hub's lower level. He laughed when they pulled him. She watched him laugh and kept her face neutral and wrote down his schedule in the small notebook she used, because notebooks could not be intercepted by signals intelligence. She did not find it easier because he had a family. She did not find it harder. What she found was that the work of watching him existed in a separate register from the question of what she was watching him for, and that register was narrowing. And one day those 2 things would be in the same room together, and she would have to know what she was. She had seen the plaza footage 211 times. She had seen the junior envoys, Petran, Ussold, and Calm, fall in the first 4 seconds of the attack, before the diplomatic personnel who had been standing farther back even understood what was happening. Petran had been 22. Ussold had been 23. Calm had been 21 and had apparently been trying to go home early when the attack began, because his transit credentials had already been filed for departure. Kess had coordinated the cell's logistics. He had not fired a weapon in the plaza. He had arranged the weapons shipment and the transit documentation, and the 4 safe houses the team had used in the 40 hours before the attack. He had attended the planning sessions. He had known, exactly and specifically, what was being planned. She completed the assignment on the 17th day of her watch. She filed her report to DAS from a relay station 3 transit hops away and spent 4 days in a bunk that was too small for her, eating food she bought from a vending unit in the corridor, not thinking about Kess's family at the transit gate. She thought about them anyway. DAS responded on the 5th day. The message was brief. 4 names struck, 8 remaining. The 5th name's location had been confirmed. There was no acknowledgement of what she had done on those 4 days between filing and receiving. The work was the work. The work went on. She stared at the message for a while, and then she wrote back. What happens if we finish all 12 and the sovereignty still says they were never there? DAS took 6 hours to respond. Then, Earth will have the names on record. The families will have an answer. The cell will not be capable of doing this again. That has to be enough. She thought about whether it was enough. She thought about Petran and Ussold and Calm, who would have had families at gates too, who would have had people grabbing their hands at the end of a shift. She thought about the plaza footage, frame by frame, the way she had watched it 211 times, trying to understand something about it that she had still not been able to understand. The 5th name was a former sovereignty intelligence officer named Vetharak, who had resigned her commission 8 months before the massacre, and was living, now, on a neutral zone station called Hareth's Reach under a merchant identity that was good enough to fool a cursory check. It did not fool Maren. Vetharak was 51 years old, which made her the oldest member of the cell by a significant margin. She had spent 3 decades in sovereignty intelligence, had been decorated twice for operational excellence, and had retired under circumstances that Maren's research suggested were not entirely voluntary. The cell had used her expertise for the operational planning, the timing of the attack, the selection of targets within the summit delegation, the sequencing of the plaza approach. She had not been in the plaza herself. She had been in a command room on the station's upper level, running communications. She had watched it happen in real time from a screen. Maren spent 3 weeks building a picture of Vetharak's life on Hareth's Reach. The woman was careful. She varied her routes, avoided patterns, maintained multiple identities. She had clearly been trained to evade exactly this kind of operation. She was not careless. She was not stupid. She had 30 years of experience that Maren did not have. What she did not have was the complete transit record cross-reference that Maren had spent the 3 weeks before her arrival assembling. Because Vetharak did not know that Maren had access to the sovereignty's own internal transit logs, via an asset that DAS had placed inside the sovereignty's border control infrastructure 3 years before the massacre, when nobody had yet done anything that required those records. The asset had cost Earth 3 years of patient cultivation, and a significant expenditure of resources that Maren had no visibility into and did not need. She found Vetharak on the 22nd day. She sat in a transit lounge 3 rows back from the woman and watched her for 45 minutes. Kareth was reading something on a hand screen and drinking something warm and looking, Maren thought, like a person who had made a certain kind of peace with herself. Maren did not make a move that day. She filed an update to DAS and spent a night thinking about what kind of peace Kareth had made, and whether that piece had anything to do with 31 people in a plaza, and whether it mattered that it didn't. She completed the assignment 2 days later. She filed the report. She did not wait for a response this time. She was already on a transport to the 6th name. By the time she reached the 9th name, she had stopped sleeping well. It was not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. It was something more like the accumulation of faces, Kess laughing at the transit gate, Kareth reading in the lounge, the others with their various ordinary lives that had orbited the massacre like satellites around a dead star. She could not stop knowing things about them that she hadn't known when the list was handed to her in an envelope. She had made herself learn everything about each name before she moved, because she believed that if she did not know them fully, she would be operating purely on abstraction, on the summit footage and the 31 names and the authorization code, and that was its own kind of wrong. Knowing them did not make the work easier. She had not expected it to. The 9th name, Drevitt, a weapons technician, was the most difficult. He was 20 years old. He had been 19 at the time of the massacre, recruited from a border station where he had worked as a cargo handler, given a job that he had apparently not fully understood the scope of until it was done. She found this in his communications records, which the transit asset had pulled messages sent to a contact on his home station in the 2 weeks after the massacre. Messages that said things like, "I didn't know it would be that, and I want to come home, and I can't tell anyone what I did." She sat with those records for 4 days. She transmitted a full copy to Das with a message that said, "This one was used. He was 19. I need you to tell me this is still correct." Das took 9 hours. Then, the authorization covers all 12, he knew. Knowing and being used are not mutually exclusive. I'm sorry it isn't cleaner. She understood the logic. She had understood it before she sent the message. Understanding the logic and needing to send the message anyway were not mutually exclusive either. She completed the 9th assignment. The 12th name took 8 more months. She tracked the senior cell commander, Aren Vash, a Vetharak intelligence official who had remained inside the Sovereignty's protective apparatus long after the massacre, moving between protected postings, through 5 transit hops, 2 failed approaches, and 1 situation that had come close enough to going wrong that she had filed a report afterward noting the operational risk, and received back from Das a response that said simply, "Understood. Your discretion." She found Vash in the 41st month after the massacre, on a diplomatic transit layover at a neutral zone hub where his sovereignty credentials briefly lapsed into a gray zone of jurisdiction. She had been watching the jurisdictional calendar for 16 months. She completed the assignment on a morning that was indistinguishable from other mornings. She sat in a transit lounge afterward and wrote the final report in the small notebook, and then she typed it up and transmitted it to Das, and folded the notebook closed and held it in her hands. 31 names: Petran, Ussold, Com, the 4 translators, the senior envoys, the junior staff she had memorized in the early weeks, when memorizing them had felt like the one honest thing she could do. She had carried those 31 names across 41 months and 11 stations and 12 assignments, and now she was sitting in a transit lounge with the work done, and the work's weight still present in a way she had not expected it to leave even when the work was finished. Das messaged within the hour, confirmed complete. Earth Directorate sends its acknowledgement. The Sovereignty's cell cannot reconstitute. You should know 3 weeks ago, the Sovereignty's Interior Minister quietly authorized a preliminary review of the summit evidence. No public statement, no admission, but they're looking at the footage. That didn't happen before. She thought about what that meant. It was not accountability. It was not a tribunal finding. It was not 31 people restored to the gates where their families waited. It was an interior minister, in a quiet office, looking at footage that the Sovereignty had spent 41 months publicly calling fabricated. She did not know whether it was enough. She did not know if that was a question that had an answer or a question she would carry forward the same way she carried the notebook, closed, in both hands. She ordered something warm from the lounge counter and sat with it until her transport was called. She was 28 years old. She had gone through the assignment at 24 and come out at 28, and Das had been right that those were different things. She picked up her bag. She got on the transport. Outside the viewport, the station fell away and the transit lane stretched ahead, and somewhere in the distance that she couldn't see yet, there was a gate and a home, and people who did not know all of what she had become in order to do what needed doing, and she was going toward them. She had the notebook in her coat pocket. She had always known she would keep it. The Vetharak Interior Minister was looking at footage he'd spent 41 months denying. 31 names were in a directorate record that would not be sealed. 12 assignments were done. She watched the station shrink in the viewport until it was gone.